Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 11, part 2. This is something that I know I teased a couple weeks ago. It got pushed back because the second paper was really the important point of focus up until now. But if you're watching this, it means we're turning our attention towards final presentations. So I want to give you some examples for some successful presentations from the past. This is all student work. It runs from the last few semesters. I hope it's going to be some great points of inspiration, give you something to think about. The follow-up discussion for this one is going to be to post ideas for the final. They don't have to be fun. They don't have to be set in stone. They don't have to be absolutely what you're going to do. They could be rough drafts. It could be 3 or 4 things in progress. It could be based on readings. You might say, you know, I really love the Marshall McLuhan text, and I want to talk about some women designers, but I'm not sure how to connect those. That's just a sort of a thought that I had right now. So think about those things. Hopefully what you see here will give you some inspiration as well, and then start crafting your ideas. If it's in a really rough state when you post something this week, great, that's perfect. That's the whole point of posting it. You're not setting it in stone. We will start to look towards the idea for the assignment coming up for the end of this week, or after the break. So it's going to help to start formulating that idea. And the more you can work towards it right now and over the break, the better off you're going to be to just dive right in when we come back after the break and we're really going full speed on the final. So here's some examples. I think if it's 8 here, I'm going to try to move through them really quickly. Again, the idea is that you're going to create a presentation. You're going to record yourself delivering that presentation. And then the deliverables are going to be the video, first and foremost, of you presenting, but I'm also going to want to see a PDF of the presentation posted and a bibliography. So knowing that all those 3 parts constitute the presentation, I'm going to show you PDFs, and I'm going to give you a sort of quick walkthrough of what students talked about. These weren't all recorded. Some of these happened in synchronous or in-person classes. And so I'm just going to sort of walk you through and tell you about what they did, and know that this is not the sort of full presentation for each one. I just want to show you what the visuals look like and give you a little bit of an overview of what the different approaches were and could be. So this first one is from, I don't know, a year or so ago, thinking about David Carson. And again, we don't want to just think about David Carson. He's a designer who's worked in a lot of different places and a lot of different types of projects. So this is the years in which David Carson was the artistic director for Ray Gun magazine. We got a little bit of background on the designer, and then we go right into some of the work that Carson did for Ray Gun magazine, with some great examples, with some references to the theories that we're talking about, a dissection of the advertisement, more examples. I can't recall what theories this student related back to, but we get a good overview of the work. We don't need the whole theory written out on the slide. So some bullet points would be nice for me to remember later on, but I think we were talking about some constructivist ideas. I think there was probably some ideas about postmodernism in here, maybe relating back to the Robert Venturi article, if I remember correctly. But mostly the student who delivered this presentation was able to just sort of speak over all the different slides and images. I went back there. This is the entire presentation. So it's a very sort of verbal heavy, a very spoken presentation, but this is a very good looking slide deck. And this can go really well with the sets of ideas employed. This next one, the student who created this was given special permission to write about a couple of publications that are technically before the time period which we're supposed to cover. Remember, you should be looking at 1982 and afterwards. But I thought this was a really great concept for the project. So we're looking at Eros magazine and Avant-Garde, and actually sort of specifically framing a question about postmodernism, looking at the contribution of these publications to the postmodern era. Again, we get some background on the origin of the publications, a little bit, maybe even more than we need for the sort of counterculture movement that gave rise to them. But the student was specifically relating this, the article, The Underground Mainstream, which we're reading for next week. This was to frame that article in relationship to these publications. And again, working from the Stephen Heller article, looking at some more examples of the work. Different pages talking through all of this, looking at the scope of some of what's behind this project. And obviously the design that's going into it. And again, we see another piece from Learning from Las Vegas. Great, we're bringing theories from class into an analysis of these publications and see two very different ideas that we've read coming together nicely to explain a little bit more. Oh, sorry, it's also talking about Fact Magazine. And then Avant-Garde. References to Futura might also invite some comparisons to the Bauhaus. They're very particularly kind of riffing off the different early 20th century avant-garde movements. That's the point of this publication. And obviously there was more background with all of these things. Bibliography to end, not necessary. You just have to send me a separate PDF of it. But I think a really well-designed presentation, very relevant topic, good use of the theories that we discussed in class. Here's one. If I'm being honest, I'm not crazy about the background on this presentation. I think it was a little unnecessary and a little too decorative. Nevertheless, I think it's a really interesting presentation. Moving away from a single designer, now looking at a particular magazine and the evolution of Cosmopolitan magazine over time. Double check for typos. I think there might be a couple in this one, but an interesting examination of the evolution of this particular publication, posing questions for the audience. Again, not crazy about the slide template, but I think it's a great question. Looking at comparisons from, going way back to more contemporary examples. And again, some older examples, the evolution of the publication. And looking at some of the ways that representation has changed over time. Great coverage for the images, all sorts of examples, thinking about how beauty standards have changed over time. I don't think it's explicit in the presentation, but I think the student was talking about rhetoric of the image, was thinking about the meaning of these images and talked through some of the ideas that we encountered in Roland Barthes. There's certainly many more. Could also look at that Robert Venturi article, could go back further. I think Marshall McLuhan might have been referenced in the discussion around this, understanding the sort of stylistic evolution of the magazine. You could certainly talk about Stuart Hall and whether or not there's also racism at play. But you can also apply some of those ideas about ideologies to thinking about gender. So these were some of the elements that were at work in this presentation. And again, I think overall, even if it ends in a question, it's an open-ended conclusion, but I think really well done. Moving back to the work of a single designer, this student is Dema Gisvalia, who is the head fashion designer for Balenciaga. Again, we're moving out of graphic design entirely, but that's great. I think it's really cool because the theories that we've covered are still very relevant, and it's an interesting designer to consider. I think this was a really well-made presentation referencing Kalle Lawson, which we're going to read in a couple of weeks to begin with, posting the thesis, the theory right off the bat. Here we have, this is a perfect, it's almost like too small in the corner, but I think it's a really well-framed argument. Dominique Gosvalia is a perfect example of what Kalle-Lawson calls a design anarchist. There's the theory front and center. That's excellent. Great lead into the presentation. That's an excellent start. Looking at the ways that that the brand embodies anti-fashion, meme culture, a little bit of a sort of a background appropriation, which is relevant to postmodernism, giving us some details about the brand, which were obviously spoken through as this was given as a presentation. Some quotes directly from the designer, which is also a great reference point. If you can find quotations from the designers where they give their own theories, that's incredible. That's a great resource to have. And then more, and again, I don't remember every word of the presentation, but this was delivered in a way that was interesting, engaging, touching on the theories. Again, sort of reconfiguring a theory based on all of this information. Again, drill down into the details, expand on some of the things that I quickly glossed over here. And this is an outstanding presentation. And I think it's a really beautiful one too, really well designed. This was a really interesting one that takes the form of a poster. Now, let me see if I might have a hard time zooming in and zooming out. Oh, here we go. So the idea, sorry, I'm just using preview for all of this so I can move through them quickly. Here's one that addresses the rhetoric of a dating app, Grindr, thinking about, sorry, I'm having a hard time navigating, thinking about how the design of Grindr reflects some of the theories that we've looked at. So we've got a kind of a good framework here. Again, if you're creating a single sheet poster or something that's a more inventive style, practice presenting it first. I'm sorry that I'm not doing a very good job with this one. But we can look at the ways that different profiles appear on the app, looking at the way the visuals send a message. If anything, you don't need these full paragraphs. You can talk through it, right? Just explain it to us. That's why you're recording a video. This is maybe a little too much text, but nonetheless, I think it's really interesting layout. And then moving towards breaking down the homepage of Grindr to understand linguistic message, non-coded iconic, the coded iconic message. And I think what was really cool about this presentation is that it sort of points towards, uses visuals to outline all of this, to understand exactly where those messages lie. And again, there's a lot more to expand upon. Obviously, we're thinking about Roland Barthes. Again, Stuart Hall would be really interesting to consider in this context. Some of the readings that we'll read for the final week, you'll have a couple options for that one, could be very relevant. But I think as a poster, and again, the way that you can navigate this adds a lot to the presentation, but visually, I think this is very well done. Here's one that also has a little bit more kind of text than I normally prefer to see, but I think a really interesting presentation. Talking about the male gaze is a term, it's a totally separate theory that we haven't covered, that comes out of film theory, and understanding that most films are made from a male perspective. So this presentation goes back to the original essay that articulates that, which is a great outside reference, an incredible additional resource on this essay called Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. Excellent outside resource to pull in. Looking at the ways that this has played a role in art. You don't need a sort of full overview. This might have erred on the side of too much history, looking at photography, also looking at design. I think those things could be very quick. There's probably more text than is necessary for those ones. Early cinema, again, just a real quick snapshot of that is fine. You don't want to dwell on it too much. But then looking at the way that Roland Barthes is relevant to that, And then looking at the way that, I think especially this image in the lower left is very powerful, understanding that there's a time period in the early 2000s when film posters, there's a dozen film posters that have this exact same shot, between a woman's legs, and it's very objectifying, it's very problematic. And this slide also, I think that image could be bigger. We could have a bigger emphasis on that. But then this idea of the Bechdel test is another outside reference, which is a great one. And it sort of builds on this theory at work here. And then looking forward to ways that some film create different perspectives, and understanding how different perspectives could be a bigger part of our cinema experience. And then changing perception for the women lead in films. Again, I think this is, there's something I would have done differently with the positioning of images and so forth, but this is a thorough investigation of a particular idea. I think even sort of focusing more on like the male gaze in early 2000s cinema would have been more exact, but still really excellent presentation. Really interesting topic. Here's another one, which is a poster thinking about the activist art and design from the Guerrilla Girls, who are a sort of, let's see if I can, again, navigate. Again, they're a sort of ad hoc group of women artists who protest some of the gender stereotypes and sexism in the art world. So this student started from a history of the group, what they've done, has really nice examples of some of the design projects that they've been involved in and have taken part in. Again, some more history here. Again, for this one, there's a lot of text on the poster. I would say probably too much. But we have a lot of great points. It's nice for me remembering. You get to see what a well-researched poster looks like, and I can actually remember what it was about. Going back to Jan Tschichold and the new typography, thinking about their use of Futura throughout, and also the Bauhaus influence on that. Again, thinking about this Stephen Heller article for next week, the underground mainstream, understanding how they've played off of mainstream sort of norms and attacked that from the underground. A little bit more history, looking at the visual rhetoric of the clothing that they wear. This is the sort of anatomy of the Guerrilla Girls outfit, where we see the mask and the pseudonym and so on. So we've got a really, and then also a little nod to Rodchenko with the production clothing and the fact that they all wear these jumpsuits. So pulling from a number of different readings, creating a really interesting poster. Again, to do this, I think this was actually an in-person presentation, if I recall correctly. But you can see how we could navigate it in a really interesting way. You'd probably have to practice that a little bit going into it. But again, I think this is a really well done presentation of information. Probably could have trimmed down the bullet points a little bit. You don't need full sentences, just a couple words for each of those would be fine. But overall, excellent layout, very cool presentation, great topic. You attach the theory to that. I believe that the Guerrilla Girls use design theory to make change in the art world. It's right on, really. And again, another well done presentation. And the last one I'll show you, just because it connects nicely to what we just read, was on Paul Rand. Now, most of Paul Rand's work is before 1982. This student found a little loophole and did an Amex campaign from the mid-1980s. So that worked, and also approached this in a really interesting way. You'll see that as we scroll through this, it was kind of like a hypothetical booklet. Paul Rand always made these pamphlets that he handed to his clients, and the idea was to create the presentation in the style of one of Paul Rand's pamphlets, which is outstanding. I think that that's a great idea. If the designer you're addressing does things like that, if anything, going back to that first one, David Carson, You probably could have gotten weirder with the layout because that's what David Carson does. So the idea of creating the presentation in the format of a pamphlet that Paul Rand would hand to his clients is a really interesting, different approach. Absolutely got my attention, worked really well. And it says right off the bat on the first page, the simplicity of Paul Rand, application of Roland Barthes principles. Great, we know exactly what the theory is, or we have a good sense of the theory here. Some of this is, it's these visuals spoken through to a little bit about his background, brief introduction to who Paul Rand was and some of his most iconic work. Especially with Paul Rand, you don't have to get too deep into this. We should all have some background. But then looking at the sort of the full anatomy of what this Amex redesigned logo looked like, looking at the messages within it. Again, there's sort of more text than I can read here, and probably more than there needs to be, but it gives us a good indication of what the content was, understanding the approach to this particular design. Digging deeper into the vision, we read Paul Rand, so you can quote, Paul Rand's theories are probably a good idea or a good reference point for understanding Paul Rand's work. And Paul Rand actually wrote a lot, so you can find a lot of theories. You have to be very careful if you wanted to do something with Paul Rand. This is another one that I okayed. It's kind of like Paul Rand is a very obvious choice. So think hard if you were like interested in that, but he's another designer that wrote a lot. And then looking at the way that Roland Barthes, Rhetoric of the Image, is related to this, this logo redesign. Looking at anchorage, again, we've got a whole paragraph describing that. And then just approaching a sort of a Paul Rand style collage as a good sort of conclusion that this presentation amounted to. So again, very good looking, talking through a few different concepts and theories that we've talked about in class, establishing a coherent theory of your own about the project, and then an interesting approach to your presentation. And these are all sort of great strategies for creating a really interesting, fascinating final presentation. I hope this is helpful. Again, I know I kind of like sort of flew through them and just kind of opened them quickly. If you have any questions, as always, please post them onto this post or add comments. If you have any sort of deeper questions about your own work, as always, please feel free to email me. Let me know what you're thinking. And I'm looking forward to hearing some ideas for what you might like to address for this presentation. Thanks.